All right, hello everyone. Thank you for joining our Tag Inspector webinar here today. And today we'll be covering everything you need to know about tag governance. Just to start off, some general kind of housekeeping items, who I am, who we are, a little bit of context. So I'll be your presenter today. That's me, I'm Lucas. I'm our Tag Inspector product manager. I also do a lot of tag management and tag governance consulting work with clients. Tag Inspector in general is a product of InfoTrust LLC. On the InfoTrust side, we do analytics consulting work, tag governance work, as well as tag management work with a number of multi-brand global organizations across three main verticals, those being news and media, e-commerce, multi-brand e-commerce, as well as the CPG space. In total, over 4,000 sites analyzed and supported annually, over 30 plus digital marketing and training programs each year, including these webinars. And then we have offices in Cincinnati and Chicago in the US, Barcelona in Spain, which is where I'm located, and then Dubai in the UAE. General housekeeping for the actual webinar. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to just drop them into the questions pane as we go along. I'm happy to, I monitor those the entire time, happy to answer any questions as we're going along, make it a little bit more interactive. And then if there's anything that I don't catch or don't get to, we will have some time at the very end for Q&A as well. Perfect. So to go ahead and jump into it, just to give you an overview of the agenda, what we'll be covering today. First, we'll just be going through some basics of tag governance, what it is exactly that we're talking about, an overview of some of the core definitions and what I mean when I'm saying tag governance. Second, we'll look much more specifics around policy and process. So what that looks like, what a tag governance policy should look like, what the process surrounding that policy should look like, and how that needs to be included at every stage within that overall tag management process as well, and tag management lifecycle. We'll then look at governance in your organization. So understanding, when you walk away from this webinar today, how is it that you can take stock of where your organization is today, and then start putting into some of these principles and practices and best practices that we'll be walking through in the actual content. We'll then go through the top 5 strategies really to focus on to improve, the keys to improve, and where you can really get the most bang for your buck when it comes to improvements in the tag governance space. And then finally, at the end, as mentioned, we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. But as always, please throw those questions in, just in the questions pane within that GoToWebinar little overlay thing that you probably have up on your screen. And I'm happy to address those as we go along. One question I'll go ahead and answer. Yes, we are recording this webinar here today. We will send out the recording along with the ability to download the slides later this week. So that will be available to you. Perfect. So with that, jump into the overview. So when we talk about tag governance, what do we mean? Tag governance is a holistic policy and process to ensure all tags on your website are performing as required and optimizing user experience. There's a few different pieces to that. Obviously, the first is that they are performing as required. That is going to mean that they're doing what they are supposed to do, both from a functionality standpoint, data collection standpoint, as well as from a compliance perspective. And they're meeting all the different requirements necessary from a legal standpoint, as well as optimizing user experience. We want to be implementing these different platforms on our website to be able to increase traffic, increase conversions, better target people, better bring the right audience to our website, collect data in order to be able to better improve the user experience on the site. We do not want our tags and our technologies to slow down our website, hinder user experience, interfere with some of the other functionality that's going on there. So a good tag governance policy accounts for that. We're addressing that. We're vetting platforms. We're monitoring platforms. We're doing all that within that tag governance policy, which we'll really dig into here today. Four main considerations or stakeholders, business units, basically to keep in mind when we're thinking about governance. Each one's going to have their own requirements and things that they need. First one being data collection / that business use case. This is your analytics team. This is your media teams that are typically the ones bringing these different platforms to the table, saying we need this particular analytics platform, or we need this analytics functionality on this new functionality on the website. Or it might be, media. We need this advertising platform in order to be able to measure conversions and measure the effectiveness of campaigns, as well as we need these platforms in order to be able to collect data about our users so that we can create better audiences, target the right people with the right ads at the right time. We also have compliance and legal, who's concerned with the websites and our data collection, marketing, advertising practices adhering to applicable laws and regulations, especially for those of you located within the EU or with a presence within the EU, adhering to e-privacy regulations or cookie laws, as well as GDPR is obviously paramount. Third, when it comes to the considerations, you have the performance team. Anything that's implemented on the website, we need to make sure that we're not hindering site speed or the performance of any of the different modules or functionality on the site. And then finally, security. Probably seen in the news over the past several months, multiple different organizations running into situations where things that they've implemented or third parties that they've introduced on their websites, checkout pages where users are entering in sensitive data, those different platforms are either hacked or they're just putting nefarious code on the website. And that's providing a portal basically for other platforms to load in, scrape information, send that off to other servers, and really siphon off sensitive information that users are putting in there. So we need to make sure that as part of our tag governance process policy, we are addressing that, giving security the opportunity to fully vet and approve all platforms. So another just quick look at those four different main stakeholders and the main questions that they're asking. I just kind of went through an overview of each one, what each is interested in, but the primary question that's going to be asked as a part of this governance process for these four different units within your organization. First one, for that data collection business use case, is the tag delivering the business value that we are looking for? Is it doing what it's supposed to be doing? Are we able to get the value out of this platform that we are supposed to be? And a big part of that's going to be, is the tag implemented and executing in the right way? Compliance and legal, does the platform conform with all required laws and regulations? Are we, collecting personal data? If so, are we taking the necessary precautions? Are we collecting PII data? Is that against our terms? Is the privacy notice, is everything updated? And are users aware of all the data collection practices, processes that are going on the website? Performance, does the tag impact the performance of the website? If so, how much? Does that potential impact or real impact outweigh the business value that's being introduced by that tool? And then finally, security, does the tag introduce any risks to sensitive data? So we can think about these four different stakeholders, and then we also need to think about each of the stages within the tag management lifecycle. So when we think about, beginning to end of a new platform, a new tag that's going to be introduced and implemented on a website, we think about these different 6 stages. First, onboarding, documentation, and review. This is when you're vetting different platforms. Maybe I'm looking for an analytics platform. I'm going to vet, Google Analytics, Adobe Analytics. I'm going to gather different documentation. I'm going to put together my documentation once I select that vendor for data requirements, what it is that's going to be tracked, all that. That whole process, when we're onboarding, we're preparing in order to be able to deploy and go through an implementation project. That's an onboarding, documentation, and review. We're gathering information, we're learning about it, we're putting together our standards. Second, once we have selected and outlined how it is that we're going to be using a platform, what platform we're going to be using, we have our technical review. For the actual tags, We are looking at, what data is collected, how is it working, performance impact, security risk, all of that. That's happening more in like isolation. This is more before the tag or the technology is deployed on the website. It's going through a technical review. It's getting signed off on prior to us being able to implement. Once we have the necessary approvals, that tag can then go into that tag implementation request process. So we're going to hand over the documentation for implementation, our requirements, all that to typically a development team or our web operations team or the team that's managing tags within your tag management system. For some of you, you might be handling this entire process end to end. I feel bad. But the tag implementation request process, again, is outlining the implementation requirements, handing it over to that team in order for them to be able to set up, implement the tag on the website. We then are actually implementing within staging and QA. So we're going through testing, making sure everything's working as expected. Then production release comes, that new tag, that new platform, that functionality is being deployed to the production environment. We need to do some testing to make sure that nothing is broken as a result of that release, as well as making sure that everything is collected and functioning as required and as outlined for that particular platform. And then finally, we have the process for ongoing monitoring. We need to be able to make sure on an ongoing basis that we're always collecting the data points necessary, our tags are always executing, our tags are executing in the right places, as well as no security, performance, legal risks are popping up in the future due to the dynamic nature of just tag configurations and JavaScript that can be loaded in through those tags, making sure that everything is always adhered to according to our standards. So those are really the 6 steps within that tag management lifecycle or a tag lifecycle. And we need to be thinking, how are each of our 4 teams or business units affected, or what is it that's really important to them within each of those different steps? So that's what I'm talking about when we talk about tag governance. The policies, the processes, the considerations that we need to take into account in order to ensure that we have the right tags in the right places, behaving in the right way, collecting the right information, all at the right times. That's tag governance, the documentation all the way through the execution. Now, policy and process. We talked a little bit about high level, what it is that's going into it. Now I want to really dig in deep to the policy and the process and what it is going to look like. So in the last section, I introduced the 6 different stages along with the 4 different teams of the stakeholders. A good way of thinking about this, again, is kind of like a matrix. That's how I have it illustrated here. So we can think of each of these different teams. What is it that they're interested in? What is important to them at each of these different stages, as well as what is it that is necessary for each team to do or sign off on in order to make sure that all of our tags are fully vetted, approved, properly working, just good to go from a tag governance standpoint. So we're going to dig into each of these different levels, and then I have some examples for some of this documentation that I've used in the past with clients just as kind of templates in order to be able to start the process for each of these different stages. First, though, again, just looking at this general structure, it's a good way to think about how we're going to need to walk through the documentation we're going to need and the approvals we're going to need as a part of that solid tag governance process. So first, when we think about onboarding and documentation, first team that's really important when it comes to the documentation, the onboarding, and that's critical in this stage is going to be that legal and compliance team. So the main question being asked here, again, is does the functionality and data collected adhere to applicable laws and regulations? So if I'm going to have users accessing that website from the EU, does this particular tag, does this platform adhere to GDPR standards? Does it adhere to e-privacy regulations, cookie laws, and the like? As far as the review and requirements, we're going to need to review the data that's collected. Is personal data being collected? Yes or no? If so, what is my legal basis for processing that data? How is that data being used? What cookies are being set? What data is being stored within those cookies? What is the expiration date of those things? All of that should be provided by the vendor within some documentation. And what's really critical and really helpful at this stage for your organization is to put together a standard template questionnaire to be able to provide to different tag vendors for them to be able to answer a lot of these different questions for you. And then that can go into your internal governance documentation files, as well as provide the basis for signing off on that platform, being able to go live by these different teams. So again, legal compliance, we're going to need to review the data that's collected, and then we're also going to need to understand, and they're going to need to have it outlined for them exactly how data is being used. How is it being processed? What is it being used for? Is it being used to target users? If so, in what way? How granularly, personally, all of that. One other consideration probably going to be necessary from the legal compliance well, obviously, definitely the contract. It's going to outline, what the terms are and everything, but also a data sharing agreement in many of these different cases, especially for organizations within the EU. Second team here within the onboarding and the documentation is going to be our business or our data team. So the question is going to be, does the functionality and data collected meet the business objectives? So the requirements, what needs to be reviewed? First, the data requirements. What is it that I'm expecting to get out of this platform? What are the requirements that I need to collect from a data standpoint with this tag in order to be able to drive the functionality that I need? So that's going to be looking at all the different parameters, everything that needs to be populated. I need to think through on my website, where is it that I'm referencing? Do I have a central data layer object? Are all of my data requirements already populated or already contained within that data layer object? If not, then I need to go back to the drawing board a little bit, and I'm going to have a parallel process in order to be able to have those things added. So important to understand those data requirements, important to go through that process and understand if there's going to need to be an addition to that data object. I also need to understand when is it, where is it these tags are going to need to execute. I need to document that. What are these events? What are these user actions on which this tag is going to fire in order to be able to drive the product functionality that I'm really looking for from this platform? Again, all that should be documented. I need to have that, and it's going to really feed into a lot of the things we're going to do down the line that we'll talk about. Third team here with onboarding security. Does the tag introduce any additional risk to sensitive data collected on the website? So again, vendors should be able to provide you requirements, information around what data is being collected. How is that data being collected? Is it something that you're passing in? Is it being passed into, are your tags contained in an iframe somewhere where that data is passed into there? So that tag or that platform has no ability to read outside of it to be able to scrape data. Are you scraping data from a page? Is there maybe native code and scripts within that platform that is scraping data from a page? All of these things, your security team's gonna have a long list of things that they're gonna want to vet. And by being able to have the actual tag script, as well as the documentation for what should be happening, how that should be happening, it's gonna go a long way in order to be able to get that vendor onboarded. Finally, performance. Number one question there, just does the addition of the tag introduce risk to page performance and user experience? Some of the things that they'll probably be looking for and need to be included in that documentation: size of the tag, number of requests that are being sent, is it synchronous or asynchronous, as well as are there additional third parties or other scripts that are going to be loading in through that tag configuration. Again, all of these requirements across these different teams, you should be able to document or put together a standard questionnaire. If you have any questions on that, definitely reach out to us or reach out to me after this discussion. We work or after this webinar. We work through this process, the creation of those types of materials with organizations all the time. But you can have that standard, you can use that as a template, and you can start then collecting that information to provide really that foundation of your tag governance policy moving forward, and to have everything, all the relevant information for live tags. Second stage of this process is going to be the technical review. Now here, again, this is before you're implementing the tag within on your like staging QA environment. Some organizations you might have just like a blank test environment where you can run the script, see the requests, see parameters, data that's being sent, all that. Others, you might just do this in the lower QA type of environment. So, or even just previewing it within a side QA instance of your tag management system. So legal compliance, what they're looking for within the technical review, they're just looking, does the actual behavior align with the stated behavior in the documentation? Most of the legal consideration and what's going to go into that is all going to be defined in those contracts and the documentation that's provided. The vendor is going to be contractually obligated to follow those standards, but it is still important to test it. Business and data, again, same type of question. Does the actual behavior align with the requirements? Testing if the data passed in tag requests, is it aligned compared to the requirements in the documentation? Security, here in the technical review, they're going to look at the actual script, one of the tag that is given, as well as once you execute that JavaScript, what is the additional configuration that's going to be loaded in. They're going to vet that. They're going to look at that, look for any vulnerabilities, as well as the documentation that's provided. Make sure there's no vulnerabilities or known risks with any of these different vendors. And then from a performance standpoint, this technical review, they can take that tag script, again, execute it in, usually there's going to be a performance testing environment or just a blank environment where they can really evaluate those different requests that are being called, number of requests, see any additional third parties that might be being loaded in, and really just highlight any potential performance risks associated with the tag that's being introduced. So technical review is going to need to be a step within that process. Following the technical review, you should be able to, in order for a tag to make its way through that tag governance process, it needs to be able to be signed off by each of those different parties. So legal and compliance just need to give an indication of approval within that tag implementation request. Same thing with security, same thing with performance. That's pretty straightforward. Also though, performance, any defined thresholds or limits that you're going to want to monitor against as it pertains to that tag in the performance context. Those are going to want to be defined within that tag implementation request so that we can use that documentation for monitoring moving forward. Most of the implementation request, the responsibility here lies with the business team or the analytics data team. They need to be including the business context for the implementation of the platform, ownership of the platform, both internally as well as externally. Who is that point of contact? Who is it that needs to be, that should be contacted when something goes wrong with this particular platform? You want to include the date range of deployment. Everything should be time boxed. One of the biggest issues that we see with organizations when it comes to tag management and tag governance is they implement a particular platform for an initiative of A/B testing, or they're using a new ad network, or just certain campaigns that are being run by a media partner that they're working with. It gets set on the site, it gets forgotten about. 3 years later, it's still on the website. There is no active activity with that particular platform, with that vendor, but the script is still there. It's adding to the weight of the page, which can introduce performance concerns. You have implications for data leakage, potential compliance issues, all just because something was forgotten about. There needs to be a date range of deployment for any tag, any pixel that's being implemented on a website. Again, you need that point of contact, technical implementation requirements. So what data needs to be collected, what parameters need to be populated, Where is that data coming from? Where is it being referenced from? Is it something that's just natively collected by the tag? Or is it something that is referenced from that data layer object on a page? And then finally, that outline of data requirements necessary in order to be able to power that functionality. This is an example, just a screenshot of a template tag implementation request document that we'll sometimes use. So you can see here on the left-hand side that information necessary, pixel group name, number of tags, what brands or what site is this being implemented on, who is the owner internally for this particular platform, is this being requested by an agency or a third-party partner? If so, who's the point of contact there? Business description for why this platform is necessary, why it's being implemented on the website, those spaces for security, legal, performance, approval, and then that time box for the life cycle of that particular tag or that platform. So putting in all these different inputs gives you a very simple one place to have all the business context for a particular tag. And then in a second sheet of the same implementation request document, we can also have the specifics for the technical implementation. So the tag or the pixel name, required URL or pages on which the tag should be executing, the firing trigger, so the events or the user actions that should be initiating that tag to load, the actual script that's going to be implemented, data attributes that are going to be required, and then any instructions. Attached also to this should be the vendor documentation, anything that you have. If you have a request for implementing like your analytics platform with Adobe, you might have your solution design reference. With Google Analytics, you might have a solution design as well. Any of that documentation needs to be included here, attached here to this implementation request form. One, to make it easier on your web operations team, your development team, whoever it is that's implementing these things. And then two, we're going to save that. We're going to use that when it comes to the documentation for our tag governance policy. And we're going to keep all of that information in one central place. And that's really going to make up the documentation piece of that tag governance policy. So we get those approvals, everything's vetted, we've got it into the tag implementation request doc. At that point, it goes into being implemented within a QA environment or a staging environment. Nothing really here for legal and compliance or security, nothing that they're really looking at here. They've already done their vetting, they've already given their approval. But here, that business team, that data team, we're going to be looking at, does the actual behavior align with the requirements? Again, those data collection requirements, are the proper parameters populated? Are the proper values passed? Is everything working as we're expecting it to? So we're testing, is the data passed in the tag requests compared to requirements in the documentation? In addition, there's also going to be a testing piece here related to performance, just seeing if there's any impact to page performance or user experience as a result of adding a particular tag to that page. Now, one thing I'll call out here, a lot of people are getting more and more worried about tags and their impact on page performance, which is understandable. I mean, it's additional code being added. There's, things can be happening. We don't exactly know what other tags or other platforms are being loaded in. By and large, though, 90% of your tags are going to load asynchronously. So they're going to load in parallel with other platforms. They're also very small requests. The size of the requests, the number of requests that are being sent are very small in comparison to your actual page content, any images you have on the page, and just other core functionality of your website. Tags in isolation, from a performance standpoint, a single tag's not really going to impact the performance of your website. Again, if it's loading asynchronously, it isn't massive. The tags and the situations that you're going to run into as it relates to tags when it comes to performance is more the aggregate. So if you remove your tag management system, for example, and you're managing all of your different tags within it, you might see a small performance improvement just because as a result of that TMS executing, it's loading in a bunch of other tags. Same thing if you have an issue or a situation where you have a tag that's piggybacking or loading in a lot of other third parties. Removing that tag, you might see a small performance improvement. But single tags in isolation are not going to really impact the page performance, that user experience. So that's one thing I always like to call out. We've done a lot of studies on this. We have some functionality within the Tag Inspector tool to block tags from loading as we're running scans and simulations of a website, aggregating that data together across hundreds of websites, hundreds of cases. It just shows unless the tag's loading synchronously or unless the tag is introducing and loading in a lot of other tags, there's not really much of a singular performance impact. So I always like to call that out. But it is still important to do that test because you never know. You never know if a tag is going to be loading in a bunch of other third parties that you're unaware of, or potentially running synchronously or throwing an error somewhere that's going to hinder the loading of some other core functionality of the site. So in implementation, in QA and staging, those are the teams that are going to test. Similarly, once this goes to production, we have our production release. Again, the business, the data team is going to quickly monitor in that production environment. Does the actual behavior align with the requirements? Is the data passed the same as what it is that was defined and what I'm needing for that functionality? And then from a performance standpoint, again, we're going to want to monitor, did the release or the introduction of these tags, did it negatively impact page performance or user experience in any way? Have a question here, and a good one. So a question was asked, any issues or concerns using a tag container such as Incitin, GTM, Telium, when it comes to performance, governance, etc.? No. It's kind of like what I was saying before. By removing your tag management system, you might see a small performance improvement in your website, but it's not because of the tag management system that's loading. It's because of all of the tags that you're loading within that tag management system. So take away the TMS, you're still going to be loading those platforms. You're still going to have that same performance weight, I guess, of loading all those different tags. The TMS is just providing you a way of more easily managing those. And realistically, you're going to see some efficiencies when it comes to performance by leveraging a tag management system. It makes it a lot easier to delay tags from executing. So any problem tags, really large tags, you might want to delay those until after all of your page content has loaded. That becomes a lot easier within your TMS, as well as loading all of those things within your tag management system allows you to more effectively and efficiently reference a central data object, such as your data layer, in order to be able to collect those different values and parameters that need to be passed by the tags managed within that tool. So you don't have to rely on as much scraping or referencing of the CSS in order to be able to collect those parameters. So really, from a performance standpoint, you're going to see some efficiencies by using a tag management system. Same thing from a governance perspective. You can remove tags a lot easier. You can add tags a lot easier, all within that TMS. It makes management and it just makes the adherence to, I guess, any type of governance policy or process you have in place much easier when you're managing tags through that TMS. Finally, then here, following that production release, where again, we're going to do that same review from the business, the data standpoint, as well as from that performance perspective. We then want to get into ongoing monitoring. Now, this is something that a lot of organizations do not have in place. Well, a lot of organizations don't have a tag governance policy or process in place to begin with. But even those that do, many will not have an ongoing monitoring process in place. And here's where we're needing to make sure that things aren't just great at first. Everything's always great at first. We put it in, we know it's clean, we know it's good because we just set it up. We did a lot of testing in the QA, everything went live, we're good. What happens a month down the line, 6 months down the line, a year down the line? Things deteriorate unless we're keeping an eye on them and unless we are going through that proper ongoing maintenance. So for ongoing monitoring, what do we need to do? Legal and compliance, we need to review and what they're interested in because the law doesn't go away. The law is not only applicable right when things go live. Does the actual behavior of these tags, of these platforms, align with the stated behavior and the documentation of the tools? So to test, we're going to look at the actual data that's passed in the tag requests compared to the requirements. Any piggybacking or unauthorized third parties that some of these platforms that have been originally vetted and approved, what piggybacking activity are they potentially introducing down the line? And again, any of those unauthorized third parties that are potentially being introduced as a result of any of the tags on our site. A lot of piggybacking behavior, it's dynamic, right? So it can change. Take a floodlight tag, for example. You can configure dynamic tags within a floodlight at any point. So I create that floodlight configuration. I add in a dynamic tag, maybe for a campaign in the future or a new activity in the future. I can add in those. So floodlight was originally vetted by legal security 4 months ago. That was the only thing that was loading at that point. Now I have a new campaign, I have a new activity that I'm creating. I'm adding dynamic tags to that. So floodlight's still loading, but now I have additional third parties that are loading through it. Legal security, they're not going to have any visibility into that. We need to monitor, we need to be able to flag that type of behavior when it comes up. From the business and the data standpoint, we need to review on that ongoing basis, does the actual behavior align with the requirements? Do I have data collection outages? There's nothing worse than going to pull a report at the end of a campaign and realizing that, oh crap, I don't have any conversion information for this. I can't really evaluate the status or the effectiveness of this particular campaign or this audience that I was testing because my tag wasn't executing or because particular parameters within that tag weren't being passed. So to test this, we need monitoring. We need to implement something where we can define those data requirements, again, that were outlined initially, and we need to be able to monitor to make sure that the actual behavior is continuing to collect those, even after we're making changes to the front end, even after we're making changes to that user experience, making sure that the back end of the data collection is still working. Security, we need to be able to review periodically the tag behavior and the data passed. So again, periodic review of that tag behavior, review of any additional scripts loaded in via the JavaScript. Oftentimes, tag platforms, they're going to update their recommended implementations every year, couple of years. The scripts might change. The JavaScript that's being loaded in from a configuration standpoint, because that's going to be dynamic. If it's a third party, that could change. So there needs to be a periodic, maybe annual security review of the different platforms that have already been approved as a part of our policy. And then similar to that legal compliance review of the data being passed by tags. This is more important in areas where sensitive information is entered in by users, but we can monitor that for security. And then finally, performance. They're already going to be doing, I'm sure all of you have teams dedicated to performance of the website, all those backend infrastructure. One thing that they can be looking at, they probably are, is just JavaScript that's running on the sites, which tags can fall into that, and making sure that there aren't any particular files or tags that are contributing to that overall page weight or taking up browser resources unnecessarily that might be impacting user experience. For ongoing monitoring, this is just a screenshot from Tag Inspector dashboard where you can set up some different validation rules looking at specifically parameters within a data object. So this is monitoring for a data layer object. Just seeing across all instances of users accessing different websites, are particular parameters being populated. So this is one example of how a monitoring dashboard or process might look like, with successes, failures, rate of failure, making sure that everything's always working. And then also, we could also, and you should be, internally creating similar dashboards or similar reporting in order to be able to have that same type of feedback for security, performance, as well as legal. So that covers really all the steps of the process when it comes to tag governance. We have our different teams, we have our tag management lifecycle, and then in order to be able to have a solid tag governance process, we need to have each of those teams, their questions, their requirements addressed within each stage. And we walked through, what that sounds like, what that looks like for each of those different teams at each of those different stages. Now, a lot of those different parts, and we talked a lot about documentation and standards there, all of that goes into the policy. So a good tag governance policy is going to be a list of platforms, as well as documentation for those platforms of approved tags, and then the documentation for each. So we need to know from a legal compliance, security, performance, all those that have been vetted, what are the approved platforms? Now, I want to approve tags at the vendor level for those legal and security purposes, especially when you start talking about like advertising tags, as well as analytics tags. You're going to have a lot of different unique instances of those in order to be able to track, specific user behaviors, clicks, campaigns, all of that. But for security, legal, all those tags are behaving at its core from a technical standpoint in the same way. So for legal and security, you can approve at that vendor level. But for all those different teams, or for specifically your performance team, again, you can have some standards at the vendor level. But then for the data and the business teams, we also need to have the requirements, the data collection requirements, and the parameter requirements and the data needs outlined for each of the specific instances. So we approve tags at that high level, organizational level, vendor level, and then for each of the approved vendors, we need to have the documentation, legal, security, performance, and business documentation. We talked about, we reviewed some of that. We need to have that for each of the approved platforms. And then we also need that list and the specifics and the documentation for the specific instances that are implemented on the website. As mentioned before, and I can't overemphasize it, time box the tags, the instances that you have live on your website. You do not want to set it and forget it, because you will. And then you might be promoted, move on to a different role, someone else is going to take over, they're going to have no idea what's going on out there on the website. We also need to, all that goes into the policy, and then we also need to map requirements, the approved and the expected behavior. For a policy, just some very loose, rough screenshots here. One, as mentioned, mapping out data requirements. This you would need to do for specific tags, maybe for your data layer object, and make sure that you understand, what is necessary in particular sections of the website or for particular user actions. And then we can translate that over here for monitoring purposes. This is a screenshot of a validation rule configuration within the Tag Inspector platform. At a higher level, you also need to have defined, those tags that are approved, allowed, and required. You can also translate that into a policy, save that into something. One, you need that policy saved in your own internal systems, your own internal wiki, wherever it is that you manage all of that, like internal governance type of documentation or compliance documentation from an organizational standpoint. But you can also translate that into a tool like Tag Inspector, which is where this screenshot is from, in order to be able to, again, test and monitor that moving forward. But that's your policy. You just need to have everything organized for each vendor, all those different requirements, so you know what should be happening, what is approved to be happening for every tag across your environment. Perfect. So now we'll get into governance in your organization. What can you do today? So many sites at this stage, because they do not have tag governance in place, are going to look like this. You have a lot of different tags loading in a lot of different ways, a lot of piggybacking that's going on. There's just no real control. And a big part of it is because there's no real visibility and no real active checking or maintenance of the tags and the governance of those tags on the website. So where you can start is just understanding what's happening, what tags are present, where are they loading, what is their functionality, and then we can start working through some of that documentation that we had already talked about for each of the different tags. This is an example here of just a standard tag inventory report where we can really look at really cleanly what are the platforms that are loading. And then for each of those different platforms, I want to look at, so I understand where am I from a governance standpoint, what do I need to create, what do I need to get and aggregate and organize. For each tag, I want to think about, similar to how we were thinking about this before when we looked at the overall tag management process and lifecycle, for my 4 different teams or my 4 stakeholders, do I have documentation? Has this platform, has this tag been reviewed by each of the teams? Have the questions that we've covered before been answered? Yes or no? What documentation do I have? Organize that for each of the different tags. I then need to understand what is the current state of that tag? What data is passed? Is that tag firing? Where is it firing? Under what conditions? Is that in line with what my initial requirements were as outlined by my documentation? And then finally, is there monitoring in place? Am I doing something? Is there some sort of process that I have in place right now for this particular tag in order to be able to monitor and make sure that it is always functioning as I was expecting it to? Again, from the documentation, that original business case. And then if not, I need to put that in place. So this allows you to do kind of a gap analysis of where you are today for each of the different platforms and what you need to be able to put together. Do I have the review, the documentation? What is the current state? Is there any type of monitoring in place? By going through this exercise, first, just getting an inventory of the platforms loading in your site so you know what's there. And then 2, going through this exercise for each of those different tags, you're going to understand where it is that you need to really focus on and start when it comes to really building out the tag governance policy, that tag governance process. Finally, you want to go through a few strategies to improve, because it's not easy. Especially as we're going through that last little matrix. I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, well, crap, I don't have this for any of the tags, and it's going to be a lot to bite off. So how can we accomplish this? What are some strategies we can use? So really, there's 5 areas. 5 areas that we need to that we can really focus on for improving. So 1, I need to gain organizational buy-in and prioritization. The biggest reason why a lot of sites are in the current state that they are when it comes to tag architecture, tag deployment, and tag governance is because there hasn't been a lot of organizational buy-in and prioritization. The organization is interested in the platforms that are being deployed because that's what's fun. That's what's tied into the overall organizational objectives and our KPIs. Your KPIs are to grow revenue. The solution for that is drive more traffic. The way you do that is, hey, let's do XYZ, marketing, advertising activity within this platform this quarter. See how it goes. Well, it's going to require a tag that gets added. The actual process and the governance around adding of that tag is not what is the highest priority. So number 1, gain that organizational buy-in and prioritization. You need to do that by discussing what happens when you don't have a solid tag governance process. Now, we covered a lot of these things in depth for gaining organizational buy-in and prioritization in a webinar back in December. And we can send that out. Let me know. It's on the website, actually, if you want to go and download those slides. But really raising the stakes. So from like a governance standpoint, GDPR, fines, massive, reputation problems, PR, mess is huge for collecting that personal data and PII data at this stage. So that immediately makes governance something that's worthwhile for the organization, as well as the cost of data leakage, the cost of data outages when it comes to analytics and media, the missed opportunities when it comes to audience creation and targeting for advertising platforms. It's huge. So looking at those, understanding what those business cases are, getting that organizational buy-in, and then prioritizing and getting resources for this type of an effort. Number two, central management and ownership. This is central management and ownership of the process. There needs to be an owner of tag management. There needs to be an owner of tag governance. That could be you within the organization. It could be a member of your team. It could be anybody. It doesn't matter who it is. There needs to be an owner. When there's too many cooks in the kitchen, too many hands in the pot, that's when things get really messy and things are no longer adhered to, as well as standards aren't put in place. Number three, better guidance. Really focus on your organization. Similar to what I was mentioning before, any external vendor that an organization might be working with, oftentimes the priority for them is obviously whatever their initiative is. Every team within your organization, the priority is going to be their initiative, their platform, their KPIs. And that's why that central ownership of governance is so important. Otherwise, you're going to start getting guidance and you're going to start getting recommendations for do this, do that, do that. It becomes too much. You have competing priorities, and governance is what kind of deteriorates in the middle there. So have an owner and make sure you're getting good, strong central guidance from that central point to be able to be applicable outwards, as opposed to letting all that guidance and competing priorities come in on the governance process. Number four, start the process off on the right foot. Really outline what, go through that process and go through that exercise to understand where you are today. What's loading today? What do you have today? What do you need today? Once you're able to go through that, start that process off on the right foot by thinking holistically about your overall architecture and the overall initiative that you need to undertake. Put together that really comprehensive project and then start checking it off kind of chunk by chunk, as opposed to just rushing into it and thinking about individual platforms and things like that. You need to start off on the right foot by having everything organized and having an overall vision and a plan in place. And then finally, increase the knowledge. Too few people within an organization understand tags, their connection to the platforms, connection to the different initiatives that are being run by marketing teams, by analytics teams, by advertising teams. They don't understand the implications of tags, and they don't understand how tags really drive that. So more people need to have that knowledge of what tags are, how they work, why they're important, as well as how it all fits together when it comes to governance, and how that entire process can be made much more efficient, much easier, as well as protect the organization. So events like today, the webinar, hopefully this is a good start when it comes to the knowledge base and that knowledge sharing that knowledge throughout or with others on your team. There's a lot of good resources out there, more and more every day. Now that more people are really focusing on tags, I'm a bit partial, but I think the Tag Inspector blog is a great place to go and gain knowledge there as well. But we need more people to understand what tags are, what tag governance is, and why it's important. So if we can address these 5 things, these 5 different strategies, starting with that buy-in and get ownership, ownership of the process, ownership of the platform, ownership of tags, start there, and that's going to be, you're going to start off on the right foot. Perfect. So it looks like we have about 5 minutes where we can go into any questions, which looks like we have a few. So the first one is a great overview for like a single site and breaking that down. How does this apply from a governance policy standpoint to a multi-brand or multi-site organization? Great question. Similar to how I was mentioning to really focus at the platform level, start the focus for your governance policy at the organizational level. So define global standards. So what are globally approved platforms? And then that can trickle down, basically. So you're going to vet certain platforms, certain global standards at that global level that can be applicable across the entire organization. Different teams, different sites, different markets can then use those platforms as they would like. And then any customizations that are necessary can happen at those lower levels as well. But we want to make it easier for the individual markets and the individual websites by providing them some standard tools in their toolkit. But we do need to have that governance at each stage. And the key there is going to be documentation, so that even at the global level, we can be aware of what is allowed and what is required at the individual website level. So things aren't inadvertently flagged, but also to make sure that everyone's on the same page, so that that monitoring and that governance process and policy overall can be upheld. A question about how do I advise to act when you realize that a tag is calling too many other tags? Excellent question. First thing you need to understand is, was it expected? In many cases, if we'll take a floodlight again as the example to use here, in many cases it's necessary. So there's two different ways that you can, or two different, we'll call them ways that you would piggyback tags within a floodlight. Some of those are for publisher tags. And the only way to be able to see and collect things like view through conversions and do some conditional firing of the tags that are necessary for like direct buys is by piggybacking through the floodlight. So sometimes it's expected behavior that should be reflected in the documentation. You should know that up front when you're implementing the tag. Now, if you did not know that up front when you're implementing a tag, it wasn't expected behavior, what I would say is check with the vendor or the person that owns that particular platform. They might give you an explanation that, hey, this is necessary for our functionality. In other cases, it's something where you're using a free plugin and nothing's really free. So they're piggybacking a lot of additional third parties that are just leaking and collecting data or cooking your users to be targeted, by others in other ways. So it's first understand, why is that piggybacking behavior happening? What is it being used for? Is it something that's approved? And if it is something that's unapproved when it comes to piggybacking behavior, and there's not anything that can be done about it, I would remove the platform. It's not following the governance policy. It's introducing security risk. It's introducing performance risk. There's going to be something else that can deliver that same functionality for you without that behavior happening. Question about what tool do I use to analyze and monitor the impact of tags on website performance? So first, just to call out what I mentioned earlier, individual tags are not going to be impacting the website performance. I look at it more holistically. So I'm looking at it from a governance standpoint. If you take care of governance, reduce the amount of piggybacking that's happening on a website, that's going to address performance concerns as it relates to tags. That's kind of step one. Step two, understand what tags are loading synchronously. Typically, this is only going to be an A/B testing tool if you are using an A/B testing tool. By synchronously, that means that the tag is the only thing that can be running in the browser. So it's going to delay other things from happening or other things from being loaded on the page. Those are the areas where there's a risk to performance. Understand those, get governance under control. You're going to minimize the performance impact. As far as just gaining some metrics, though, I use Tag Inspector. It does collect a lot of performance metrics around tags, has some functionality where you can block tags from loading to get some baseline figures to see the tag's impact on page performance. And it looks like with that, we are out of time. There are a couple of additional questions in here, which I will follow up with each of the respective parties via email. But thank you all very, very much. As mentioned, we will be sending out a recording as well as a link to be able to download the slides here later this week. So be on the lookout for that. Definitely don't hesitate, reach out to us, reach out to me if you have any additional questions. We're happy to help. Love to help, and hopefully we will see you soon on future webinars. Thank you all very much.